Welcome, everyone. We appreciate you being with us today. On behalf of the University of Texas College of Liberal Arts Development Office and Public Affairs teams, I'd like to welcome you to On Course with Liberal Arts. Our faculty and students make an impact through their study of the issues that our society faces, and we're proud to showcase the college's outstanding research and teaching. Today's topic is the long-term effects of the COVID-19 economic crisis. If you have questions for Dean Stevens, please send them via the chat function, and we will answer as many as possible in the last half of the webinar. It is my honor to introduce you to our speaker, Dean Ann Huff Stevens. Ann Huff Stevens became Dean of the College of Liberal Arts in July of 2019. She came to UT Austin from the University of California, Davis, and is a Texas native with roots in Corpus Christi. At UC Davis, Dean Stevens was a professor of economics and served in a variety of leadership roles, including chair of the Department of Economics, chair of the Economics Graduate Program, interim dean of the Graduate School of Management, and founding director of the Center for Poverty Research. She earned an undergraduate degree from American University and a doctorate in economics from the University of Michigan. Prior to her work at UC Davis, she served as a faculty member at Rutgers University and Yale University. And now I will turn it over to Dean Stevens.
Thank you. Thanks, Angie, and thanks to all of you for spending your lunch hour or whatever free time you have with me. It's a pleasure to be able to talk a little bit about my research work over the years that unfortunately is unusually relevant at this moment in the US. So I will spend a few minutes talking about some of my work that looks at the long-term effects of job loss on individuals and families and the implications beyond that. And I will, we will, as Angie said, have some questions at the end. I'll talk for maybe 20 or 25 minutes, and I'll also watch and chat if there are questions that come up, but I can't promise that my multitasking will allow me to address them right away, but we'll come back to them at the end. So thanks, it's great to, I want to say see all of you. I can see your names, but not your faces, but I really appreciate you tuning in. So let me just start by saying a little bit about why I, over the years, have done a lot of work and what motivated me to study these long-term effects of job loss. I'm going to try and share my screen. First technical challenge. Okay. All right. So in a simple way, I think the obvious question to why someone would want to understand the effects of job loss is that job loss is a feature of almost any modern dynamic economy where particularly in recessions, there are large numbers of job loss. But the truth is that businesses close, make changes all the time. And so there's always at least a low level of these job transitions or involuntary job transitions in the economy. When we get into a period of contraction or recession, there tend to be large numbers of these, and there may be private cost to society, and that's sort of the fundamental reason. It turns out that there are costs imposed on individual workers long term, but also economists and sociologists over the last couple of decades have noted that there are also a lot of costs that extend beyond the economic ones. There are health costs that move to the next generation, and I'll say a little bit about my work on that. So that's sort of just the focus on individuals. The second thing that to economists and social scientists is particularly interesting when we think about studying job loss is that they provide a little bit of a laboratory for understanding the ways that income and earnings affect a whole host of outcomes. So the typical lament of social scientists is that it's challenging to do social science work because we don't really have laboratories. We can't, in most cases, set up experiments because we're thinking about effects on humans and complex interactions that aren't easy to study in a laboratory setting. But what job loss does is, while it's unfortunate for the people involved, unfortunate for the economy, it does give us a little bit of what economists call a natural experiment, where we can look at how individuals and families react and are affected when they face a sudden discrete change in their earnings capacity. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And that helps inform us as to the role that income can play in a whole host of social and economic outcomes more broadly. The final bit of why, especially right now, it's important to understand the really individual-based effects of job loss is that this really feeds into what ultimately happens and determines the shape and the speed of an economic recovery. And so the effects on individuals that I'll talk about that my research has focused on turn out to be a really important part of a set of drivers that tells us, for example, how quickly will we come out of the current recession, and what can we do to speed that recovery, because ultimately it's all about how individuals are interacting in the economy that helps us, that leads to a recovery eventually. So I'll talk about all of these factors. But let me start with a really fundamental fact about job loss that will probably surprise absolutely no one, but it's a pretty stark effect. And that's a graph that looks like this. Pretty simple, where what are these lines? So this is just plotting what happens to earnings of an individual who loses a job through no fault of their own. So either as a result of a firm closing or a mass layoff that's driven by, in most cases, this is a study from the 1990s, I believe from the state of Connecticut, but they all look pretty similar. So what happens to earnings? And you'll see there's a line, the line starts at 0. That's indicating if we compared a person who is going to lose a job to someone else who doesn't lose a job, you can see that their earnings, after making a few statistical adjustments, controlling for things we know about the people, the 0 just says their earnings are no different than a comparison group. They're going along. You'll see down here, we look at years relative to their separation. Year 0 is when the job loss occurs. And again, this is the unsurprising part. Earnings fall pretty dramatically. So these are annual earnings from the 90s, about a $4,000 loss, which in this sample turns out to be about a 20% reduction in earnings. The thing that was less well understood for a long time by economists is that the earnings after a job loss, even once individuals are reemployed, and most displaced workers are reemployed within a year, you still see that earnings never quite recover. And so the key fact about permanent job loss is that it carries with it a largely permanent reduction in earnings capacity. And this sample turns out to be something like a 9 to 10% long-term reduction in earnings. And so that's sort of a starting point. And this is really something that I documented many, many years ago with my with my PhD dissertation. That was how I started in this line of research, and much more research has happened since then. So if we think about the implications of that, what's interesting is that you can imagine that there aren't very many events that happen in a worker's life that lead to such a long-term change, downward change in earnings. For the most part, we go along, earnings may be variable, we may have good years and bad years, but this is a pretty significant discrete fall in earnings, and that's what really allows us to think about other implications of that. One of the real challenges that economists face in trying to untangle the role that income plays in a whole host of outcomes, educational, health, social, is that it's very hard to distinguish cause and effect in many cases. So we know, for example, that children from lower income families, from poor families, have worse outcomes. But it's very difficult to know if they have worse outcomes because whatever conditions made the family poor in the first place, whether it was education, health challenges that may have affected the parents, whether those also affect the kids, or whether it's simply that there was a lack of resources to invest in kids' outcomes and health, and that results in long-term worse health. But when we have a case, this is another graph from a study of mine that is showing the same story as the previous slide, but just puts it in a slightly different way. So here you'll see two lines, and this is for a group of parents, of fathers in this case. And the solid line shows fathers who in 1982 had a job loss because their firm laid off a large number of workers. This is Canadian data in the 1980s recession. The dotted line is for those fathers who were also working in similar industries and companies, but whose companies survived the recession without these mass layoffs. And the key thing here is to note that before the job loss happens, these two lines are on top of each other. And that's showing that these families seemed in economic terms pretty identical, some similar levels of earnings before the recession hit, and some of them lost jobs and some didn't. And that's important because it helps us understand, we really now have an example of, if you think about kids in these families, if you looked at them and took a snapshot in 1979, you would predict on an economic basis similar types of outcomes for the kids in these two sets of families. By 1984, you see a real gap open up. And then if you ignored the rest of the graph, excuse me, and looked at them, you might expect different outcomes because they face different economic realities. So once these differences open up, then we can start to ask, well, what are the long-term consequences? So here we see about a 10 to 12% income gap open up in these two sets of families. This study was, the data we had for this was really interesting because it was very unique data that actually allowed us to follow up as the kids from these families grew up. We were able to get essentially their earnings records when they became young adults, when they were in their 20s. And what you see is that the kids in these families who, when they were in their teen years or earlier years, had about a 10 to 12% income reduction from the parents' job loss. As the kids grew up and became adults, the children in group 2 ended up earning about 9% less than the kids in group 1. And this is the type of thing that allows us to think about long-term effects of these income reductions, to try to learn that this is a sign that there may be some real effects of reduced income on a whole host of outcomes. Some other really interesting work and really sort of startling work that came out a little bit before this study by some other economists showed that another fact about this type of income, of permanent job loss and the resulting income reduction, is that you see for the parents, you see over the next 20 years, significant increases in mortality. And so there are very serious health consequences of these income losses as well. And so there's if you start to think, well, health deteriorates, the kids' outcome deteriorate. Another study that I was involved in shows that for younger kids whose parents lost jobs, you see in the immediate next few years, these kids are much more likely to have to repeat a grade. So they look like they're going along academically, doing well, and then because of this disruption to the family, to the income, they start to struggle academically, which probably doesn't surprise any family who's had kids and been through some sort of economic struggle or other social struggle, but it's documented on a fairly significant scale. You see real effects of these over time. So I want to say a little bit at this point, as we've learned that these job losses have effects that go out into the next generation, that affect health in the long term. That does tend to make us think a little bit about what this means for the overall economy. And I think from my work, I use this work to start to understand a bit more what can be for those of us, for economists who study economics, who study microeconomics, who really are focused on an individual level. This type of result helps you to think about the other type of economics, which is macroeconomics, which is thinking about the overall economy. And in particular, if this is what at a micro level a recession looks like and what effects it has on individuals, you can start to understand one of the real challenges to generating a recovery from a recession. Because one of the things that we think about when we think about, for example, right now, there's a lot of talk about unemployment insurance. Is it adequate? Should we expand it or not? And the key thing to note is that the programs we have to support job losses or unemployed workers are really focused on this initial period where there's a really sharp reduction here. But the key is that even after unemployment insurance is over and workers go back to work, there's a big reduction in income and in purchasing power for people who have been through this. And when you start to think about a recovery, what will generate a recovery for the overall economy, of course, is when people start to engage in the same level of economic activity they were before the recession. We need consumers and investment to get back to its routine level. And one way to interpret these results on an individual level is it adds another challenge, because if you have a lot of job losses, as we did in the Great Recession, as we're experiencing now, although I'll say a little bit more about the type of job losses, then you start to see why even when most people start to go back to work, there are these lasting income losses. And so it may take a little bit of time for the economy to recover and really start to look like the same levels of output and productivity and spending that we had before the recession. So, the current situation is interesting from an economic perspective because it is, I think we can all agree, a pretty unusual recession. It's unusual in a lot of different ways. One is that the joke is that economists typically don't know we're in a recession until several months into it, because it's based on, looking back at levels of economic growth. Well, this is a recession that we all kind of knew as soon as it happened, because the immediate economic disruption was so well defined and extreme, because we shut down, for reasons of public health, a large number of companies, and so there was a huge spike in unemployment. The other thing that's unique about this recession that I'll talk about a little bit in this graph is that it really started out as there was a lot of talk about furloughs and temporary layoffs from jobs. And so this is a graph from early in the current episode, from early April or late April, where in most recessions, the numbers that you want to keep an eye on if you're thinking about the labor market and recovery, or even about individual consequences, would be this blue line of permanent job losses. And you can see in 2008, as the Great Recession started, you had a big uptick in permanent job loss, which is what sort of imposes the types of long-term cost on individuals and families I was talking about. And in the last recession, there were some uptick in temporary layoffs, but we, as an economy, we don't sort of use temporary job loss as much as we used to. There tend to be either people stay employed or they face a permanent job loss. Well, that might give you a little bit of a sense of optimism with the current economic climate and recession, because you'll see here in 2020, we didn't see, at least as of April, a big spike in permanent job losses. And even as it was unfolding, a lot of the people filing for unemployment believed that they were simply temporarily unemployed from their current employer. And of course, everyone is in a sense temporarily unemployed, we hope, but what this meant is that most people were expecting to go back to their current job. And the temporary job loss avoids a lot of those long-term consequences I'm talking about, because what makes those costs so long lasting is the need for workers to really find a new match with a new employer, a place where they're equally productive or can develop skills to be productive with a new employer. And that takes some time, and it takes resources and investment in either learning new skills or finding another match with an employer. With temporary job loss, you just go back to what you were doing before, and so that limits the cost. And early in this recession with COVID, there was a lot of hope that many of the job separations that people were facing were going to be temporary, and that they would be able to go back to their employer. Unfortunately, I think many people were skeptical about that from the very beginning, because the key to that optimism lasting, of course, is that those jobs that have initially temporarily laid off workers, those businesses have to survive. And as this period of reduced economic activity goes on, there's less and less reason to think that most of these initially temporary job losses will stay that way. And so that is really the last picture I'm going to show you. This is just showing over the last several months what has happened. So you see the gray area is the fraction of unemployment that's driven by temporary closures of businesses, and the orange by permanent. And so initially there were relatively few permanents, but over time, of course, that's drifting up. And so we're now seeing workers who thought they would have a job to go back to, who unfortunately really don't. And one of the key indicators to, I think, keep a watch on if you're concerned about the recovery and the prospects is the number of business closings we're seeing. And we're seeing a lot, really hard hit industries, retail, food establishments. A lot of those are small businesses that may not have a big cushion to survive, to continue to pay leases. And so we are seeing a lot more permanent closures, which of course suggests that some of those long-term consequences are likely to start to kick in, and also, of course, complicates the recovery and may slow down the recovery. You may have heard a bit about what's been called a V-shaped recession, where we thought that because the economic activity went down and that decline was so steep, the hope was that we would have a similarly steep recovery. My own forecast here, just among the few of us on this call, not to, hopefully no one's going to hold me to my economic forecast here, but I think as permanent business closings increase, the chances of a sort of really rapid recovery, a V-shaped recession, as it's called, are really vanishing, because we are going to have to face that there's going to have to be some retooling, restarting of businesses and reshuffling of workers, because as time goes on, we are a little more in a looking like a more regular recession, where we do have a lot of permanent job losses.
One of the questions here is, do you have data to show multi-generational poverty being perpetuated by potentially low-level jobs that are easily lost? Are there data on helping these families improve job success?
So that is actually something that less connected with this work, but I have done a lot of work on the dynamics of poverty in the US. And it's incredibly difficult as a social scientist to get intergenerational data, because you really have to follow families for a very long time. But we do have some, and certainly there is a lot of persistence across generations of income status. And so a lot of poor, we do have some data where we see kids grow up in poor families, and they do have a disproportionate chance of staying poor as adults. But one of the areas of economic research that I've been involved in just a little bit has started to try to document what types of programs can be helpful in breaking those kind of intergenerational cycles. Certainly, one of them that there's pretty limited evidence on because it is so difficult to study, but it's a little bit of the flip side of my work that shows that that when a parent loses a job, the kid's income as an adult is lower. There's a little bit of evidence that shows that, for example, when parents through training or other supports can increase their education and earnings, then that follows to the next generation. Those kids do better. And so that there definitely is evidence that these interventions can also have intergenerational effects if we can stabilize and improve employment for parents.
Would you like one more, or you want to keep going?
No, sure.
Okay, next question is, who is having this type of conversation with Congress as they decide how to appropriate funds to help individuals impacted by what is essentially a self-inflicted recession due to the pandemic?
Yes. So, who is having this type of conversation with Congress? I think, I was listening to a podcast on this topic this morning, and there's a whole set of issues about how we address unemployment and try to promote a recovery. And I would say right now, the US policy in this area is in an unusual, and I think this recession has really shown some of the insufficiencies of our unemployment insurance system. So this is something Congress will be deliberating on in the next couple of weeks, I believe, as they try to figure out what to do going forward with unemployment benefits. So what do I mean by exposing deficiencies? I said we generally only think of unemployment insurance as it really only addresses that initial period of very steep earnings losses while workers try to find new jobs. But even that system has some real challenges. And so one that is directly related to the current debate is that the unemployment insurance system is, in almost every recession, it is revealed that the state-run unemployment insurance systems in almost every state are underfunded. That the tax revenues they collect from workers and employers to pay out benefits, those accounts get out of balance in a recession. And in many cases, they can, over the years of the recovery, they can come back. I think the Great Recession was particularly hard on a lot of state UI systems. And once we got out of that recession, we didn't really do much about it. And so state UI systems went into this recession somewhat underfunded, and the large numbers of benefits that are being claimed really have stressed those systems. So in that setting, the federal government and their initial relief packages stepped in and provided a federal unemployment benefit to supplement unemployment insurance. And it's been very helpful in the sense of, if you think about those long-term income losses, and I was arguing that if we want the economy to recover, people have to have resources to spend and protect their homes and take care of their families. And so that is a slightly different motivation for providing assistance than the typical unemployment insurance system. The unemployment insurance system is intended to support workers through a short-term period of unemployment and allow them some income while they search for a new job and find a new match. The problem is that for most workers, so the unemployment insurance in normal times will pay on average, I think the average replacement rate of income is somewhere around a little over 50%. It's much lower for higher income workers who lose jobs and a little bit higher for the lowest income workers, which is by design. There's a thought that the lowest income workers don't have very much slack. What the federal unemployment benefit was doing, though, was to try to supplement that really less with an eye towards ensuring the short-term period of unemployment, and really aimed at supporting the economy and making sure there was income in the system so that people wouldn't stop spending and make the recession even worse. The problem you may have heard about is that the current federal benefits mean that for our lowest wage workers, current benefits, which expire, I believe, this week, are now often paying them more than they would get if they went back to their original job. There were good reasons to do that with the massive economic shutdown we were facing, but it does create a disincentive to go back to work. Now, I think that's a big debate that the Republicans and Democrats are having in Congress right now. My own take is that there were good reasons to do that, but we shouldn't probably be linking those types of payments to being unemployed, because it does create this unfortunate incentive to remain unemployed. And so I wandered away from the question, but how we structure unemployment compensation to both help individuals, but also support an economic recovery is a really key issue right now.
Were these data in your slides, were they parsed apart for ethnicity?
Let's see. So in a couple of studies, so the study I showed that linked the data to kids' outcomes, unfortunately, we knew very little about the people. We didn't have ethnicity in those data. The reason is that it's really hard to get a set of data that shows both parents' earnings and a complete record there, and then follows those families until their kids grow up. And in fact, the only way we were able to do that is my co-author was able to get access to a series of longitudinal income tax records that could be linked across generations. So there you have this massive amount of earnings data, but of course on an income tax form, you don't have other demographics and more information. We didn't have even education, ethnicity. So we know a little bit. There aren't strong patterns or differences across ethnicity per se, but there are differences in patterns for higher and lower income workers that you sometimes see that are often correlated with education, with ethnicity.
Thanks. Are there any data that show any trickle-down job losses? Meaning, does a loss of one FTE potentially lead to less work for another FTE, which can lead to shorter work hours and potential loss of another job? And I believe that's full-time employee FTE.
Right. So there is. This is exactly how the recession sort of deepens and is perpetuated, and then what you have to kind of address to come out the other side of a recovery. And so what I think of as a typical recession, which is pre-COVID, often you will see a recession hit certain industries first. And in many cases in the 80s, it was really hit manufacturing companies early on. And so what tends to happen there is manufacturing workers lose jobs because of some reduction in demand for their products. A factory shuts down, and then supporting industries, so restaurants, services in the area of those businesses, then those either shut down or lay off workers because there's less demand for those related services. Similarly, in manufacturing, you think about parts suppliers or people who make inputs into production. What's different about this recession, it's not that different, but it started differently in that the service industries were really, really hard hit initially. So that was kind of the starting point. But again, as it goes on, there are related, as demand for services falls, as income losses fall, demand for, in particular, retail has fallen. And so there's definitely this sort of trickle down and then eventually, hopefully, a trickle up. The other thing that is fascinating and challenging about this recession is typically a recession is a reduction in consumer and investment demand, and you have to stimulate that demand. People have to want to go out and purchase and make investments again. What is unique here is that there are a couple of other really challenging factors. One is that it has to be safe for people to go out and engage in economic activity. And so we don't, prior to this, no economist was really thinking about the fact that we need to make sure for an economic recovery that consumers are comfortable going out and, being in retail stores, or business people are comfortable going out and considering investments in physical land or facilities. And that is an additional challenge that we haven't really confronted. And that's how the public health situation and confidence in that is very much connected to the economic recovery here. It's a different type of interconnectedness that we face today.
Thank you. I just want to remind our audience, don't forget, if you have a question for Dean Stevens, to type it into the chat, please. Next question is, this is the second once-in-a-lifetime economic crash in less than 15 years. Is this going to accelerate income and wealth inequality, and how will that likely be distributed across income ranges?
That is a great question. If I were, say, teaching a class on income inequality, that would be a great essay question. So you have a future in exam writing, if nothing else. I think, yeah, it's interesting. You're right that the Great Recession was record-breaking in all sorts of dimensions until we had the COVID recession, which has broken those records. Whether it exacerbates inequality really, I think, depends largely on what the recovery looks like. I would say, the Great Recession, in a sense, inequality had already taken off so much. I'm not sure I would credit the Great Recession with worsening it, but here what would concern me from an inequality perspective is that because of one of the features that has driven the rise in inequality in the US is a long-term divide between jobs that are really careers and jobs that are more focused on either physical production or physical interaction. So I'm thinking of basic services and manufacturing. And then there are careers and jobs that are more focused on information exchange. And in some sense, the current recession has hit hardest, of course, those who have to be physically together to engage in production or to provide services. And those jobs tend to be lower paid and have been part of the kind of bottom half of rising inequality. Those of us who engage in thinking and writing and can work easily remotely are having a much better time in this recession. And so there's a real divide among skills and education and income levels, which would suggest that this recession I would say there's a good chance that it could have a bigger effect on exacerbating that underlying inequality if we aren't able to help people affected really recover and get back into jobs, because it is hitting the lower half of the distribution, I think, a bit harder.
Thank you. Next question, does the experience of the United States in the 1930s furnish any basis for comparison with today's predicaments?
Almost certainly. I'm torn on this because, we did have in the 30s, how did we get out of the Great Depression? Well, part of it is that we had eventually massive investments in a major war. Also, though, some massive investments in new safety net social programs. So there are definitely things to be learned. I come back to what an unusual precipitating factor this recession had, where we had this pandemic that required us to just shut down economic activity. And so we are already engaging in more government spending early in this recession through the stimulus packages than we did, for example, early in the Great Recession. So that may save some of the purpose of the stimulus that came from other social programs and fighting the war. I think what the question makes me think of is, I do think it is probably essential that we use this experience to really think about how we design our safety net programs and our social assistance programs in a smart way. I mean, the thing that social science has really come a long way on since, certainly since the 30s, but even since the 70s and 80s, is that we know a lot more about how to design safety net programs that can minimize disincentives and can really maximize the ability to support workers and transfer income to them in a time of need without creating a drag on the economy. So we know how to do that. We know more how to do that today than we did decades ago. The problem is that it's not clear that the political system we're currently in is allowing that to happen. And so I say this not to really put blame, but I think because we've been in this crisis situation, I come back to the way we've addressed unemployment insurance. There's certainly reason to give very generous benefits to workers in need right now and to support those families. But we know from economic theory, you don't want to do that by structuring an effective unemployment insurance system that pays workers more than their wages. It's like deciding that some homeowners need some extra assistance, and so instead of people with a $400,000 house having insurance for that, we're going to give everyone the $800,000 home insurance policy, even if their house wasn't worth that much. So that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I think the key thing I would say that maybe we've learned, some of the programs that started in the 1930s have been incredibly valuable in supporting the elderly, other programs. I think if we're smart about how we design programs to help with the recovery and provide assistance, that would be a good use of the knowledge we've generated and how we know better how to do that now than in the past.
Okay, we're going to make this the last question, but take as long as you need, of course, to answer it. As an economist and a dean, can you speak to the academic impact of this year's incoming freshmen who were in late elementary school, middle school at the time of the last Great Recession, which may have negatively impacted those students' families, income, and health, and are now entering the next phase of their educational lives in another deep recession and global pandemic?
Yes, another great question. I think the first thing I'll say is that the challenges that you see for example, kids whose families have maybe already experienced some sort of individual economic challenge, catastrophe. One of the most powerful ways to address that is if those kids can get advanced education. And so the fact that some of those kids are, say, coming to the University of Texas in the fall is probably the best news they could have, that despite the challenges their families have experienced, being able to invest in their education. And of course, I say that and want to note that a big challenge we face at the university is to make sure that these students who are entering during these really rough years are well supported, because they have to graduate. It doesn't help a lot to get 1 year of college education today. You need to be able to persist and graduate. And so, maintaining our really high graduation rates is going to be critical. The other thing I'll add to that is you'll see occasionally references to the difficulties that students have when they graduate into a recession. And so there's been a lot of work that says, if you happen to have the bad luck to complete your education during a recession year, you're going to earn less over your lifetime. There's a sort of stickiness to that effect as well. That is absolutely true. However, I would caution that those earnings reductions that are based on graduating into a good economy versus bad over the lifetime are actually pretty small, and they're incredibly swamped by just graduating and getting that advanced education. And so really, I think the message for our students and for all of us is to continue to understand the value and how, in essence, what we do here every day really helps to address these major challenges, and supporting our students and making sure they get through to graduation is kind of the key. Okay, so I think that was the last question. I really, this is a wish I can make, because I know that with the size it can't happen. I really wish I could unmute all of you and hear and see you all, but I will save that for the next chance we have to meet. And I will just say thank you for tuning in and listening, and I enjoyed talking with you all. Thanks, Angie.
Thank you, Dean Stevens, for sharing your important work with all of us and for embodying the idea that what starts here changes the world.